religion, science, truth, and morality. We know that there are a range of worldviews represented in the room, and we invite you to bring your voice into the discussion. It's totally okay to disagree with what is said tonight, and we invite you to ask questions. Our hope is that we would do so with respect and grace for one another. On your tables, you'll see some paper, some purple pieces of paper with a QR code to a Slido link where you can ask questions throughout the talk, and then our speaker will be doing a Q&A towards the end of the talk. So feel free to scan that QR code now and ask your questions. You don't have to create an account or anything. You just scan the QR code and can begin asking questions. You can also upvote questions that you really want to get an answer to. So first we're going to have our speaker talk for about 45 minutes, and then we'll go into about 15 to 20 minutes of Q&A. And without further ado, I'm going to introduce our speaker. So our speaker tonight is Dr. Tom Rudelius. He is a professor of mathematical physics at Durham University in England. His research focuses on string theory, quantum field theory, and early universe cosmology. And he has a blog on science and faith called Veritas Christo et Ecclesiae. Please help me welcome Dr. Tom Rudelius.
Great. So thanks very much, Pima, for that kind introduction. And thank you all for joining me with what will hopefully be a fun and interesting evening as we look at this question, science and faith, friends or foes? So before I get into everything, let me start out by just saying that if you find anything that I have to say today interesting and you want to learn more, I'm going to point you to this book called Where the Conflict Really Lies by a famous philosopher of religion named Alvin Plantinga. I came to faith when I was a sophomore at Cornell University studying math and physics. And as a budding Christian and a budding scientist, this was, for me, one of, I think, the most influential books that I read in shaping the way that I think about religion and science and the relationship between them. So I'd highly recommend, and some of what I have to say today will be heavily influenced by this book. A quick outline for where we're headed today. I'm going to start out by talking about science and the Bible. I'm going to then talk a little bit about science and atheism. And finally, we'll talk about the meaning of life. So some big questions. Let's get going. And first of all, science and the Bible. So as I mentioned, I was raised in a very non-religious family. I came to faith my sophomore year of college at Cornell. And so for me, my journey of faith started in some ways around the same time as my journey of science, at least the journey towards being like a professional scientist. And as a result, for me, science and faith have always been intertwined. That my approach to one is actually very similar to my approach towards the other. However, what I've seen, what you all have certainly seen, is that within our culture at large, there's this general view that science and religious faith are at odds with one another. And I think oftentimes if you ask people who talk about this conflict between science and faith, where they see that conflict, sometimes there isn't really much of an argument at all. Sometimes it's just sort of this is what we've all internalized, is that science and religious faith are sort of eternally at war with one another. But there are also, I think, some legitimate questions, some legitimate puzzles, some apparent points of contradiction, at least, that people tend to point to. And I think that, in my experience, the two that come up most often are, first of all, the question of miracles, which occur in many religions, in particular in Christianity, in particular in the Bible, in and around the life of Jesus, as well as the biblical account of creation. Now, I've talked at length, in fact, here at MIT, in past Reason for God series, about the first of these questions, miracles. So you can find those recordings, or I'm happy to talk more about it in the Q&A afterwards. But today I'm going to focus on this latter question, the creation account in Genesis 1-3. So without further ado, let's talk about two accounts of creation. And we'll start with the biblical account. So the creation account in the Bible is largely contained in the first 3 chapters of the first book of the Bible, which is called Genesis. And what happens in Genesis chapter 1 is that God creates the universe, the earth, humankind, everything in 6 days, and he rests on the 7th day. In Genesis 2, we get this picture of God creating the first man and first woman, Adam and Eve. He places them in the Garden of Eden, this paradisal state full of sunshine and rainbows and butterflies, and everyone is happy. But then in Genesis 3, the serpent comes, convinces Adam and Eve to disobey God, to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which they've been forbidden from doing. And as a result, Adam and Eve are banished from the garden. They're kicked out into this broken world of pain and suffering and evil and death that we all find ourselves living in. Now, the Bible itself never makes a claim as to how old the universe is, how old the earth is, how long ago these events might have happened. But what you can do, what in fact Christian and Jewish scholars have done for thousands of years now, is occasionally they've sat down and tried to calculate the age of the earth and the universe according to the Bible using the genealogies in Genesis. So in Genesis you read that Adam was the father of so-and-so, who was the father of so-and-so, and so on and so forth. And so you can try to estimate how old are people when they have descendants, how long do people live, you add up the numbers, and you get something of order 1,000 to 10,000 years. So the most famous dating is about 6,000, and indeed, today if you look at public opinion polls, something like 10% of Americans believe that the world is about 6,000 years old. Now this stands in stark contrast with what modern science has to say. So modern science tells us, in particular cosmology, tells us that the universe began about 14 billion years ago with a very mysterious and poorly understood event called the Big Bang. About 4.5 million years ago, the Earth was formed, and a few million years ago, humans evolved in some form from ape-like primates. So I think the points of conflict here are sort of obvious, but just to draw them out explicitly, modern science says that the time between the Big Bang and the formation of the Earth was billions of years, not 2 days. It says that the time between the formation of the Earth and the emergence of humankind is also billions of years. And the first humans evolved like any other animals. They weren't created out of the dirt or out of anybody's rib, as we read in Genesis 2. And humans have been around for millions of years, not 6,000. Okay, so some pretty obvious points of conflict, right? So what is one to do with these points of conflict? What do modern thinking Christians do? Well, there's different viewpoints. Of course, anyone you talk to is going to have a different viewpoint, but in general, these views can be sorted into one of 3 camps: young earth creationist, old earth creationist, and what's called theistic evolution. So young earth creationists basically would say that whatever you read in Genesis is just the literal truth. The earth, the universe, humankind, all 6,000 years old. A young earth creationist would say that yes, maybe evolution occurs within a species. They wouldn't deny, for instance, that bacteria can evolve to become resistant to antibiotics, but they would deny that evolution is responsible for the diversity of life around us. Now, an old earth creationist, on the other hand, takes a more moderate approach. An old earth creationist would generally say that science is right when it tells us about the age of the earth, the age of the universe. These things are billions of years old, and that Genesis 1 should be interpreted more figuratively or metaphorically rather than literally. An old earth creationist might say that these 6 days in Genesis 1 aren't literal 24-hour days, but maybe they represent more like ages of millions or even billions of years at a time. However, an old earth creationist would typically say that Genesis 2 and 3 should be read literally, that there were literal humans named Adam and Eve. Finally, a theistic evolutionist would say that basically you should just trust the science on all of this. The Earth, the universe are billions of years old. Humans have evolved like other species, but a theistic evolutionist would say, in contrast to an atheistic evolutionist, that this isn't all just pure chaos, this isn't all just randomness. Ultimately, there is a God behind all of this, who has a plan and who has used evolution as part of that plan. So these are three different views, and it's important to understand that these views don't just come out of nowhere. They come from different views among Christians of what the Bible is and how we're supposed to relate to it. So in particular, a young earth creationist would say that the Bible is the ultimate authority for everything. It tells us about faith and morality, but it also tells us about science and history. And therefore, science, when properly understood, will cohere perfectly with just a purely literalistic, straightforward interpretation of Genesis. An old earth creationist, on the other hand, would say that, yes, of course, the Bible is an important source of God's truth. But also, science is an important source of truth. And since these two sources ultimately have God as their common source, they can't be in conflict with one another. So yes, maybe we haven't fully interpreted the science correctly, but it's also possible that maybe we haven't fully interpreted the Bible correctly. And when we have interpreted them correctly, they'll sort of fit together like a jigsaw puzzle, and everything will be revealed to be in perfect harmony. Now, a theistic evolutionist is similar to this. A theistic evolutionist would say, yes, of course, the Bible is an important source of God's truth, and science is an important source of God's truth, but they're really sources of different kinds of truth. Science does a great job at telling us about mechanisms, how things work, how the world has come to be. The Bible, on the other hand, does a better job at telling us about meaning and purpose. Why does the universe exist at all? Why are we here? What's our purpose in life? A theistic evolutionist would say that the Bible is not a science textbook, and it's not meant to be read as one. It's not meant to tell us how God created. Rather, it's meant to tell us about the character of the God who has created. So, who's right? And let's, for a moment, put aside the question of what science has to say. Let's go back in time a few hundred years before scientists have figured out any of this, right? We don't know about cosmology. We don't know about geology. We don't have the science informing us. Who's right? Well, even then, there's still this question. Because what's really at stake here is the question of interpretation. And when it comes to interpreting this text, or any text, it's important, first of all, to understand what is the genre of the text I'm reading. You don't read a poem or a song the same way that you read a letter, or the way that you read a science textbook. And the same thing is true of the Bible. The Bible is, after all, not a book. The Bible is not a book. It's a collection of many different books that were written by many different people from many walks of life across many centuries. It has poems, it has songs, it has narrative. It has many different genres. Some of the genres perhaps don't match one-to-one with the genres that exist today. So it may not always be so easy to tell when reading a text like the Bible, like Genesis, what is the genre of this passage that I'm reading. Nonetheless, what I want to try to argue today is that there are at least some hints that what we're reading in these opening chapters of Genesis maybe are not meant to be read as just straightforward science or history. Maybe there's something else going on here. So with that in mind, I'm not going to read all these words, and I don't expect you to read them all, but let me just flash Genesis 1 to you for a second. Genesis 1, again, is where God creates the universe in 6 days, and he rests on the 7th. This is the very first chapter of the very first book of the Bible. And something I want you to notice in this creation account is the use of repetition. And God said, and let there be light. Let there be a vault. Oh, there we go. Let the water under the sky be gathered in one place. And God saw that it was good, and God saw that it was good, and God saw that it was good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the second day, the third day, the fourth day. These repeated structures showing up again and again across the 6 different days. Now here's the point. This sort of repetition is probably familiar to you in songs or poems that you might have read. Songs have verses, poems have stanzas. These repeated structures maybe appear from verse to verse or from stanza to stanza, and yet there's some variation. So already just glancing at the layout, the format of Genesis 1, already some hints that this may be more of a poem or a song than a scientific account. Similarly, if we start looking at what these words are actually saying, next slide, we start looking at the content of what's going on here, we'll see that there's this organization that many have noticed throughout the centuries, whereby on days 1, 2, and 3, God creates these different domains. And on days 4, 5, and 6, he fills the respective domains with their inhabitants. So on day 4, he fills the light and the darkness with the sun, moon, and stars. Day 5, he fills the water and sky with birds and fish. On day 6, he fills the earth and vegetation with land, animals, and man. Again, maybe another hint that the organization here is more thematic than chronological, as you might expect from a science textbook. Furthermore, issues arise when one starts to try to combine the narratives that we read in the opening chapters of Genesis. In Genesis 1, for instance, God creates humankind, both male and female, on a single day, day 6. In Genesis 2, on the other hand, a huge number of things happen between the time that God creates Adam and the time that God creates Eve. He creates Adam, he brings all the animals to him. Adam sits there and names them one by one. He realizes that there isn't a suitable helper for him. He grows lonely, and so finally God creates Eve. Perhaps just a very busy day, but at least a surface level reading of Genesis 2 would suggest that maybe this is happening over a longer period of time than a 24-hour day. Further such questions arise when we start to compare Genesis 1, 2, and 3 with the later chapters of Genesis. In Genesis 2, for instance, God creates Adam and Eve, the first man, first woman. He places them in the Garden of Eden. Genesis 3, they rebel, they're booted out of the Garden of Eden. In Genesis 4, they start having kids. We read that they have 2 sons, Cain and Abel. Cain infamously kills his brother Abel out of jealousy. And as punishment, God forces him out to wander among the earth. Cain then complains that anyone he meets out there is going to kill him. And God says, no, don't worry, Cain. Even though you really don't deserve it, I've got your back. I'm going to make sure nothing happens to you. And so indeed, Cain goes out. Nothing bad happens to him. He finds a wife and founds a city. Now, to us as modern readers, attempting to read these passages the way that we would read a historical or scientific account, some big questions arise here. These are supposed to, stay there, thanks. So some big questions arise here. We have Adam and Eve, first man, first woman, and we have their 2 sons, and one of those sons is killed. So Cain then worries about the people he's going to run into out there. What people? Right, this is the question that necessarily arises in our mind. Who are these people that Cain is worried about meeting? Who is this wife that he finds? Right, this is supposed to be the only family on earth as far as we know. So is this his sister? If so, a bit strange. Surprising that we're not told this. And then, who's living in the city, right? These are some of the questions that I think for us as modern readers necessarily arise when we read this sort of thing. And here's the point that I want to make about this, is that there is really no such thing as a straightforward reading of these chapters. Young Earth creationists, old Earth creationists certainly have thought about these challenges and have come up with answers. But what's definitely true is that the answers are not evident just from the text itself. One has to do some sort of extrapolation. One has to do some sort of explaining, climb through some sort of hoops to try to mesh these different chapters together. Ultimately, there is no such thing as a literalistic, straightforward interpretation of these chapters, because any interpretation brings up questions, raises puzzles that we, modern readers, are maybe not so equipped to be able to answer. So the point of this is that questions of interpretation of Genesis could have arisen, should have arisen, and in fact did arise long before modern science came around. Long before science came around and raised these questions about how old the earth is and how old the universe is. People already were starting to wonder, do these passages require us to read them literally? Is that how we're supposed to understand these passages? And so St. Augustine, writing around the year 400 AD, could write about the opening chapters of Genesis. In matters that are so obscure and far beyond our vision, we find in Holy Scripture passages which can be interpreted in very different ways without prejudice to the faith we have received. In such cases, we should not rush in headlong and so firmly take our stand on one side that if further progress in the search for truth justly undermines this position, we too fall with it. This isn't just a modern issue, the question of interpreting Genesis. Rachel Held Evans said it like this: the problem isn't that liberal scholars are imposing novel interpretations on our sacred texts. The problem is that over time we've been conditioned to deny our instincts about what kinds of stories we're reading when those stories are found in the Bible. That's because there's a curious but popular notion circulating around the church these days that says God would never stoop to using ancient genre categories to communicate. Speaking to ancient people using their own language, literary structures, and cosmological assumptions would be beneath God, it is said, for only our modern categories of science and history can convey the truth in any meaningful way. But it is no more beneath God to speak to us using poetry, proverb, letters, and legend than it is for a mother to read storybooks to her daughter at bedtime. This is who God is. This is what God does. Ultimately, I think that the challenge of creation and evolution really goes away if one does not insist on a literalistic interpretation of the opening chapters of Genesis. There may be other ways of dealing with that problem. Old Earth creationists, young Earth creationists, as I say, definitely have other explanations. But if one doesn't insist on a literal reading of the opening chapters of Genesis, this problem, I think, goes away entirely. Now, there still may be another problem that some might raise about evolution when it comes to the compatibility of evolution and theism. And this is one of inefficiency. Evolution persists, according to modern science, over millions and millions of years. In this time, there's a huge amount of life and death, random mutations, decay. It's often wondered, why would God go through that whole long song and dance just to get to humans, just to get to his image bearers? Now, I personally think that this is actually a knockdown argument against the idea that you and I live in a simulation. Because imagine that we're living in a world, in a universe, that's being simulated by some alien kid living in his alien mom's basement in some parallel universe, who just has too much free time on his hands and it's nothing better to do than to simulate worlds full of intelligent beings. If there is any sort of limitation on that alien kid's computer for efficiency, it would be incredibly inefficient for him or her to simulate this entire process of evolution. It would be incredibly inefficient to simulate the dynamics of black hole mergers in distant galaxies. Incredibly improbable that you and I would be living in a universe like this if it's just being simulated on a finite computer. But this is the key distinction between the idea that we live in a simulation and theism, is that the God of theism is not limited in any way by efficiency. I think that ultimately this objection works under the assumption that God is an engineer. An engineer seeks to accomplish their task as efficiently as possible, with the minimum amount of materials and time and computer resources. But I think the God that we read about in the Bible should be viewed not so much as an engineer trying to build the world in the most efficient way possible, but rather as an artist trying to build the world in the most beautiful way possible. I think, to me, the clearest indication of this we find in Job, the book of Job, chapter 38. What's happened in the book of Job, a very famous allegory on suffering, is this guy, Job, has been suffering. He's been experiencing all these calamities, and he's been arguing with God. He's been wondering with God, why is all this happening to me? And finally, after 37 chapters of this, God speaks to Job out of the storm. And the way he responds to all this suffering isn't the way that maybe Job would want, which is an answer for it, an explanation of why it's happening. Rather, what he does is he basically just says, hey, Job, I'm God and you're not. And the way he specifically does this is to point to all these mysteries in the natural world, these things that Job doesn't understand, but which God knows the answer to. And in the end, Job is left speechless, and he realizes that he has no business questioning God's plan for his life. What we see in this response from God, I think, is an illustration of God's love for the natural world that he's created. After all, in Genesis, when God creates the earth in the 6 days, he proclaims it good. And God saw that it was good, and God saw that it was good, and God saw that it was good. God enjoys this natural world that he has created. And so I think it's at least plausible. When I hear atheistic evolutionary biologists talk about how beautiful evolution is, I think it's at least plausible that maybe God just also finds evolution to be beautiful in the same way that they do. So we've talked now then a little bit about science and the Bible and science and God. What about science and atheism? What about evolution and atheism? Do those fit together? Now, it's almost a funny question to ask because, again, in our culture, there's this idea that science and atheism are best of friends. Richard Dawkins, maybe the most famous atheist of the last 100 years, is an evolutionary biologist. And if I were to talk to people in the audience here who identify as atheists and ask you why are you an atheist, pretty good chance that we'd hear something about science and about how great science is. We've assumed generally that science and atheism go along perfectly, but is this true? Well, what do you need for science to work? The first thing you need is a species whose cognitive faculties are reliable and oriented towards truth. And the problem with atheism is that if atheism is true and evolution is true, then our cognitive faculties have been built not for truth, but for survivability. Patricia Churchland, in a very famous quote, says this, boiled down to essentials of nervous system, enables the organism to succeed in the 4 F's: feeding, fleeing, fighting, and reproducing. The principal chore of nervous systems is to get the body parts where they should be in order that the organism may survive. Truth, whatever that is, definitely takes the hindmost. Even Charles Darwin himself seemed to realize this. With me, the horrid doubt always arises whether the conviction of man's mind, which has been developed from the mind of the lower animals, are of any value or at all trustworthy. Would anyone trust in the convictions of a monkey's mind if there are convictions in such a mind? Let me phrase this tension in a way that's maybe more familiar or feels more reasonable to me as a physicist. So I could ask you a question. Why do we trust our minds? How did our minds come to be so good at telling us truth about the world? All indications are that they are very good, right? My perceptions of the world seem to actually make sense. I can predict what I'm going to eat for dinner tomorrow night, and I can make sure that that is actually what I eat. We can do mathematics. We can solve the equations that are needed to understand the universe. Our cognitive faculties, all indications are very reliable. Why is this? Well, the evolutionary psychologist has a ready answer for this. Here's what the evolutionary psychologist says. They say that this is all part of natural selection. Because if I have true beliefs about the world, right, if I know I'm hungry and I need to eat, then this will lead me to act in a more rational way. I will, in fact, go get food so that I'm not hungry anymore. This will allow me to survive better, and if I'm better able to survive, then I can pass on my cognitive faculties, my ability to think rationally, to my offspring. And so there's this nice feedback loop between true beliefs and beneficial behaviors provided by Darwinian natural selection. A very nice story, right? Probably what you all either were taught or what you sort of came to believe based on your biology classes. Now the problem with this is that to me as a physicist, this doesn't really make any sense. You see, from at least an atheistic physicist perspective, everything that happens in the world, everything you and I do, is completely determined by the laws of nature. Now, depending on your view of your interpretation of quantum mechanics, either we have just deterministic evolution of the wave function, everything is completely determined by the laws of nature, that's the entire story, or maybe if you have a different interpretation of quantum mechanics, there's some quantum randomness involved, but that you and I certainly don't have any influence over that quantum randomness, right? This is just pure randomness plus equations dictates everything that happens. Free will is an illusion. Consciousness is an illusion. At least that's what some of my colleagues have told me. I'm not exactly sure what that means. But the point is that you and I, our beliefs have no bearing on what actually happens in the world. What happens in the world is determined by the laws of nature. Our behaviors that allow us to better survive are determined by the laws of nature. And so this raises the question of what's determining our beliefs. My beliefs don't have any impact on my survivability, according to the physicist's tale. My beliefs don't have any impact on anything. They're just sort of these accidents of hormones gone haywire, chemicals interacting in my brain, that somehow this emergent consciousness has arisen. These pictures don't fit together on atheism. So why should I trust my cognitive faculties at all? Why do we have beliefs that correspond in a rational way to the world around us? That's the first big mystery, the first brute fact that atheism requires for science to work. But there's more than that. We also need a universe that follows science, a universe that follows these mathematical equations with regularity. The same laws that apply today will also apply on Saturday. They also apply for Galileo when he studies gravity by dropping objects out of a tower. Science requires uniformity, regularity, law of nature. On atheism, our universe just exists. It just is. This is just how it is. There's no reason for it. It's just a brute fact. The law and regularity that we observe are just bits of cosmic serendipity without further explanation. In contrast, the theist would say that ultimately the rationality of our universe follows from the rationality of our creator. Regularity is to be expected, and our ability to think rationally as a species is an integral part of the human story. You see, the Darwinian view of natural selection, to believe that that's what's given rise to our cognitive faculties, requires free will to play an integral part, that my choices determine, that I consciously choose, impact my survivability. For an atheistic physicist, free will is just an illusion. And part of the thing, maybe the thing that I like best about theism, is that I think it allows me to take seriously both my science and also my subjective experience of the world. That I don't have to say that everything I experience is just an illusion, morality, free will, consciousness, that they're just illusions. They're just chemicals in my brain. I can both simultaneously say that science is good and true and beautiful, but also that there's a deeper story, which is also true and beautiful. So let's talk a little bit about that story now. I started out by giving this viewpoint of perhaps science is best at telling us about mechanisms, and religion and the Bible are best at telling us actually not about mechanisms, but about meaning and purpose. So with that in mind, let's go back and look at the opening chapters of Genesis again. Now, not so much with the ideas of, through the eyes of a skeptic, trying to prove or disprove everything that we're reading. But let's instead go to it with a different set of questions. What does this tell me about God? What does this tell me about me? What does this tell me about our purpose and our meaning in life? So, Genesis 1, God creates everything. Genesis 2, and he calls it good. God creates everything and he calls it good. In Genesis 2, God creates Adam and Eve. He places them in the Garden of Eden, along with these two trees, among others, the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And he says, you can eat from any tree in the garden that you want, but you can't eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. But you know what happens? The serpent comes, he convinces Eve. Eve and Adam eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And as a result, lest they eat also of the tree of life and live forever in this broken and messed up world, God kicks them out of the garden. And we read that he places this flaming sword flashing back and forth to guard the way to the tree of life. Now, as I say, there are different Christian interpretations of this text. Perhaps Adam and Eve were literal people. Perhaps this story literally happened somewhere. But what I think all Christians will agree upon is that there is definitely some sort of larger meaning here. That this is not just an account about two people named Adam and Eve. After all, in Hebrew, Adam means man, and Eve means living. In a sense, Adam and Eve represent all of humankind. Because all of humankind has in some way chosen to go our own way. All of us have rebelled against God and tried to be our own gods, to put ourselves in God's place, to be masters of our own fate. And what we find when we do this is that things don't work out the way that we want them to. All of us are separated from this so-called tree of life. What is the tree of life? What does this represent? Well, one Hebrew commentator puts it like this. In the Bible, the tree of life is an image of eternal life, which is obvious. You eat of it, you live forever. But also, it's an image of irretrievable loss. It's an image of cosmic nostalgia, a longing for something that we remember, yet we've never had. C.S. Lewis, the Christian thinker, said it like this: most people, if they had really learned to look into their own hearts, would know that they do want, and want acutely, something that cannot be had in this world. The late New York City pastor Tim Keller, in all the music you go to kind of give yourself a high, you're actually looking for a song you remember, but you've never heard. What you're looking for in love are arms you remember, but you've never had. Cosmic nostalgia. All of us innately have this sense that the world isn't right. It isn't quite the world that we were made for. And yet, in a sense, it is, right? All of us have been thrown into this world. We didn't ask to be here. I didn't ask to be thrown into a world full of pain and suffering and death. And yet, we all have found ourselves here, and now we have to find some way to make our lives meaningful, to make it through this broken, messed up world, to find something that we think is going to make us happy, to bring us meaning and fulfillment, if you would like, to bring us back to the tree of life. What we ultimately find, though, is that all of the things we turn to end up being insufficient saviors. David Foster Wallace, who was a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, certainly no theist, once said this: in the day-to-day trenches of adult life, there is actually no such thing as atheism. There's no such thing as not worshiping. Everybody worships. The only choice we get is what to worship. It goes on to say that no matter what that is, it never really works out. In fact, it always ends up being sort of our downfall. This is the one that resonates with me, probably resonates with a lot of you here at MIT. Worship your intellect, being seen as smart. You will end up feeling stupid, a fraud, always on the verge of being found out. What David Foster Wallace and C.S. Lewis, Tim Keller are saying is that ultimately, nothing we turn to really does the trick. We're looking for things that aren't to be found in this world. And the Christian response to this is that, in fact, they are not to be found in this world. What we need is not to try a little bit harder, to just do a little bit better in school, to get a little better job, to make a little more of ourselves. What we actually need is just for something outside of this world to come in and reach in and rescue us. The tree of life shows up again. It shows up in the very beginning of the first book of the Bible. It shows up again in the very last chapters of the last book of the Bible. It's called Revelation. And the Apostle John, this early follower of Jesus, has this vision of the future world. And in this world, heaven and earth have become one. That the world has been restored to the way that it was supposed to be, to the home that we were truly made for. Eden has been restored. And there he sees the tree of life with its 12 kinds of fruit. Humanity once again welcomed back to the tree of life with access to it again. This is the future that he sees for humanity. Now, let me first of all say, when you see the same image showing up at the very, very beginning of a book, and then you see it showing up again at the very, very, very end, there's a pretty good hint that everything in between is sort of about this image. The entire Bible, in a sense, is a story about exile and homecoming, about humanity, broken humanity, being kicked out of the garden, finding ourselves living in this world of pain and suffering, and yet someday, somehow, being welcomed back. So how do we get from point A to point B? What's the key thing that's happened in the meantime? And the answer, of course, is that Jesus has come. Jesus is the one that God has sent to rescue us, to give us access once again to the tree of life. Tim Keller, again, says it like this: at the beginning of history, there was also a garden and a command. God put Adam and Eve in the garden, and they were told not to eat of the tree. The direction was, obey me about the tree, and you will live. Obey me, and I'll bless you. But they disobeyed. And as a result of this disobedience, all of these terrible things, death and decay and disease and suffering, all of these things enter into the world. But, Tim Keller continues, now there is another garden, the Garden of Gethsemane, where Jesus prays right before his crucifixion, and a second Adam, and another command. Jesus Christ has been sent by the Father to go to the cross, which is also a tree. To the first Adam he said, obey me about the tree, and I will bless you. And Adam didn't do it. But to the second Adam he says, obey me about the tree, and I will crush you. And Jesus does. Just as Adam's disobedience brings the curse of pain and suffering and death into the world, so does Jesus' obedience to God and going to his own death bring life into the world. This is the Christian hope for the afterlife. Not disembodied existence, not that we go to this abstract place called heaven, but that we will be resurrected into the new heavens and new earth. Eden restored, the world as it was always meant to be, with eternal peace and joy that we were always made for. This, according to Christianity, is how the story ends, and this is how my talk ends tonight, so thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rudelius, for that talk. As a person of faith and science, I find that the two don't often naturally intersect in my day-to-day life, so I definitely enjoy engaging in discussions where the two are talked about in tandem. So now we're going to go to our Q&A section of the night, and you on your tables you can find some purple pieces of paper with a QR code to the Slido link. It's also on the screen, so feel free to scan that and submit your questions. You can also upvote questions that you agree with and would like to have answered, and then we'll just be going through them. And then if you'd like to ask a question out loud or live or in person, just raise your hand up high, and then we have someone with a mic who will give you the mic, and we can get that. You can answer your question out loud live if you wish. Okay, so the first question that we have is, how do you determine which parts of the Bible are literal? If interpretations vary, doesn't this undermine the Bible as an authoritative text?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So, first of all, let me start, I guess, with that second half. I don't think that it undermines the Bible as an authoritative text at all, because the first thing to say is that every Christian, right, it's not just the theistic evolutionists. Every Christian recognizes that there are some parts of the Bible that are meant to be read literally and some that are not. So for instance, Jesus when he was on earth, told lots of parables. Parables are short fictional stories designed to convey some sort of moral or theological point. You don't read a parable literally, right? A parable is very much not meant to be read literally. Same thing if you ever take a look at the Psalms, if you ever take a look at the Proverbs. These are songs, these are poems, and this is something that is definitely in the Bible, whether, no matter how little of an interpretation you might like, there are parts of the Bible that are definitely meant to be read like this. So I think that reading the text as it's meant for us to be read, reading the text as we're meant to read it, reading the text as we're meant to read it, is really what it means to take the Bible as an authoritative source. Now, as for the question of how do you determine, well, again, this is a question that arises for everyone, right? Any of you who have taken the SATs or something, there's always this question of interpretation, that you're asked to read a passage and understand, how am I supposed to interpret this? So those challenges always arise, and that's just a part of life. When we read a text, we need to figure out how do we interpret this. One thing I do want to say, though, sometimes I'm asked, if the opening chapters of Genesis are meant to be read figuratively or metaphorically or something like this, then what about Jesus? What about the resurrection? What about these things? But I think that sort of what that question envisions is a view of faith, a view of the Christian faith that starts with the assumption that the Bible is the inerrant Word of God, and then from that we derive the resurrection of Jesus, which is really the linchpin of the Christian faith, the central moment, the climactic moment of Christianity. But that's really putting the cart before the horse, because I would say that the right approach is to start with Jesus. I find the historical evidence for the life, death, miracles, and resurrection of Jesus to be compelling. And from there, I ask the question, given that I think the evidence for this historical event is strong, how then does that impact my interpretation of the rest of the Bible? So I think that ultimately the central moment of Christianity, the central figure, the central character of Christianity, who's Jesus, my view of him is not impacted necessarily by how I read the opening chapters of Genesis. In fact, it should be the other way around.
Thank you. And you touched on this a little bit in your answer when you said that the historical evidence that you found is compelling for the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. So this next question is asking, is there any explicit external evidence, i.e. not the Bible, that supports the existence of Jesus or God? So could you just add more details to your previous answer?
So as far as Jesus, I think there's far too much evidence for me to be able to discuss it here. I've talked about it more in other talks that I've mentioned before about the miracles of Jesus. But I think, first of all, it's worth noting that the overwhelming consensus of historians of Christianity, including very skeptical ones who definitely don't think Jesus was the risen Son of God, is that Jesus definitely existed. Part of it is that Jesus is mentioned in many non-Christian texts from around that time. And there aren't a lot of texts, period, from around that time, right? So you don't necessarily expect to have libraries and libraries full. But in some ways, we actually do have a lot more about Jesus than most any other character in the ancient world. Mentioned in both Christian sources, in biblical sources, extra-biblical Christian sources, non-biblical Christian sources. So that's one strong line of evidence. Another strong line of evidence is the fact that there's just too much counterproductive material in the gospel accounts of Jesus' life for it to be entirely legendary. Things like, for instance, the fact that Jesus was crucified, and a very embarrassing fact for the early Christians that they were having to try to explain. You don't invent some sort of detail that you're then going to have to try to work to explain. Same thing with the baptism of Jesus. Baptism of Jesus, a bit hard to explain for a Christian who holds that Jesus was the sinless Son of God. Not impossible to explain, I think, by any means. But the point is, if you're inventing a story of some fictional character named Jesus, you don't invent problems for yourself that you're going to have to spend millennia working to address. Those are just two examples, but there's many, many other things like that. Ultimately, we have very early sources. There are creeds that we read not in the Gospels, but in Paul's letters in the Bible, which likely date to within a decade after Jesus' death, in which people are already worshiping him. They're calling him the Christ, the Messiah. They're proclaiming his resurrection, and they're willing to suffer and die for it. Very hard, I think, to convince someone to suffer and die for the resurrection of some person that was entirely made up. So ultimately, I think that's not a serious argument, or the idea that Jesus didn't exist. As far as the existence of God, I could, again, talk for a long time about what I think are the most compelling arguments. I think that, in a sentence, I think that the contingency argument, which raises the question of why does something exist rather than nothing, why does anything exist, why this particular universe, why these particular laws of physics, that to me is a question which I think maybe doesn't prove the existence of God, but at least points to it as a possible solution. From there, I think that the evidence for the fine-tuning of the laws of nature is a compelling argument. And then to that, you could add things like morality. I talked a little bit about our experience of free will, which doesn't make a lot of sense to me if there's not some bigger picture going on. And then the evidence for and miracles of Jesus. And finally, just the evidence from my own life. So I would say that there isn't just a single argument. I would say there's a long tapestry. But to me, then, theism and Christianity are just the best explanation of everything in general. There are definitely questions I still have. There are, I think, some things that atheism explains better than Christianity. There are definitely some challenges. The problem of evil and suffering, which I think you all heard about not too long ago here. I think there are definitely good challenges, so don't get me wrong. I think there are good questions that people have about faith, and I can definitely see why it wouldn't appeal to some people. But for me, I think on the whole, the evidence points towards it. Thanks.
Great, thanks. And if anyone is interested, so I see a live question over here. But if anyone is interested in looking at like specific non-biblical historical pieces of evidence, I would recommend checking out the book The Case for Christ, which was written by Lou Engle, who I believe is a journalist who started out as an atheist and tried to go about from really journalistic principles of research, going about trying to find evidence for, well, he started out trying to find evidence against Jesus and ended up finding evidence for Jesus. But yeah, I would love to take your question.
Hi, yeah, thank you so much for talking today. So I'm someone who's not religiously affiliated, but also not really atheist or agnostic, just kind of like curious and open-minded. And I think one thing that I find that I've kind of like noticed in like hearing about Christianity for a while is that I feel like from my perspective, I wonder why it feels so like there's such a strong focus on kind of like suffering and like a negative view of the world. So for instance, I noticed this in your talk as well, as like you refer to like, the world as like broken and wretched, and you refer to like the self as like, like every human being inherently has this feeling of like something being out of place, or like this isn't the world for them, or there's like great suffering. And so I guess like one question I have is like, what do you think Christianity has to offer to people who are like happy, don't have like a worldview that is like, oh, the world is like fundamentally broken? Because I think also even in my personal life, like I've noticed that religion like tends to help a lot of people who are like deeply suffering, like drug addicts and things like that. And I think that's like really great and really positive. But for someone who just like doesn't necessarily have a religious worldview, but like thinks their life is like fine and meaningful, like what do you think Christianity has?
Yeah, so I mean, let me say first of all, I think that's a really good question. I feel like you kind of like hit the nail on the head there. That is like almost to a T sort of the worldview that I came to college with. That, as I say, I was raised in a very non-religious family. I always liked doing math and science, and I thought, the world's like basically a good place. People are basically good, and I just didn't see too much need for it. I think that's something in my book that was referenced earlier on. What I said is, when I first was asked this question of what do I believe, I didn't feel like really atheist or agnostic really fit right, because it's like, well, I just don't really care that much. And maybe you do care, but to me it just didn't seem like there was some great compelling need for it that forced me down the path of looking into these questions in the first place. So first of all, I want to say, I think maybe I have given too bleak a view of the Christian view of the world, because the Christian view of the world is sort of that there is this tension that we live in a world has been made by a good God, and so there is lots of good in it, and there's lots of beauty in it, and so it's a good world, but that it's also broken, right? So I don't mean to give the impression that this world is like nothing but pain and suffering and death, because that's not the Christian view of the world, right? It's that there's this tension. And yet, what Christianity does, and why I think it really focuses in on them, is because I do think that these are like the great existential questions that face humans at some point or another. And like, maybe for right now, for everybody in this room, things are going well. But I would guess that there's probably a spectrum, and I would guess that there are some people in this room for whom things are going really terribly right now. And I would guess that for just about all of us, there will come a time where we'll feel like that. Because the sad reality is that, bad things happen, loved ones die, and in those moments, what, generations of Christians have found is that something about this worldview really addresses those questions head on in a way that no other worldview really does. And in particular, the way that Christianity addresses them, sort of like God's answer to Job, it isn't a direct answer and a direct philosophical explanation of why these things are happening, but rather it's a God who in Jesus suffers with us and suffers alongside us, and who gives us hope through resurrection. And I think what I've found in my times of suffering is that is the response that I really need. And so there's something special about that. For me, the moment when I went from being sort of like an apathetic, agnostic, whatever you want to call me, to being a Christian was the first time that I found myself in this place of suffering, of feeling like I just don't have the answers. I'm not equipped to deal with what I'm going through right now. And in that moment, this Christian message just made a lot of sense to me. But if you're not in that place, I could definitely see why the message might not make sense to you. I will say that I think that the Christian gospel is really good in lots of different ways, that it addresses, not only the questions of death and suffering, also questions of forgiveness, also questions of injustice, that kind of like, sort of, I would say, whatever the problems are that you have with the world, the gospel has some sort of response to that you might find true and beautiful. So anyway, but I definitely resonate with where you're at. Thanks.
Our next question is, does science allow us to determine the existence of the Christian God versus other gods in other religions?
That's a really good question. I think that as I laid out for me kind of what is the evidence that I follow, that I find compelling, I think that science alone really gets us part of the way there. So I think, for instance, that the fine-tuning argument, the fact that the laws of nature seem to be tuned exactly what they need to be to give rise to intelligent life, the fact that our beliefs do make sense of the world, that our cognitive faculties are reliable, these sorts of things to me point to a God who actually cares about humans. So as opposed to some sort of far-off deistic God who just sets the world, the universe going, and then, hey, life just happens to exist. I think fine-tuning suggests a God who cares about what's here. So I think and I think the contingency argument suggests a God who's very powerful, who's outside of space and time. So I think we can start to get some attributes from maybe the scientific world, but ultimately I think that for me, the best evidence for the Christian God comes from the person of Jesus. So I think if you took Jesus out of the picture, for me, I would still think that there is some sort of God, some sort of like divine thing out there, but I think I would be pretty agnostic as to who or what it's like.
If God knows all and sees all, why did he create Adam and Eve knowing they would sin and would have to be kicked out of the garden?
Yeah. So this is one way to state, I'd say, the problem of evil and suffering. And in particular, it's one way to state the problem of evil and suffering, that why would God create this world knowing that evil and suffering were going to come? And to be honest, I feel like I'm just not the person who has the best answer to this question. For me, I would say that let me speak from a scientist's perspective now. One thing that I've found in being a scientist is that there are times where I just have to be okay with mystery, and that's okay. That mystery doesn't necessarily imply a contradiction. So to give an example closely related to the one I talked about today, biologists, to my knowledge, are still very puzzled by the question of where did life begin? How did life begin? That evolution can say, go from this life to that life, but how do you get life in the first place? As a physicist, I study string theory and cosmology, and there's all sorts of questions that, I could ask way more questions than I could answer, basically, says someone who studies fundamental physics. And yet, the fact that there are these mysteries doesn't, to me, say, well, therefore, everything else is just wrong. For me, I think I've come to find that the problem of evil and suffering is a bit like that. I don't necessarily have an answer. I don't feel like I have a great explanation. But what I do see in Christianity, as I mentioned, is a God who's willing to suffer alongside us, which to me tells me that God has a good answer to that question, even if I don't. That he knows about suffering, that he cares about it so much that he was willing to come experience it. And that somehow there's hope, because as Jesus was resurrected, so too do we have hope for our own resurrection. That, to me, is enough to take away the sting of the problem of evil and suffering. For me, it takes it away from being the category of catastrophic problems for theism to being in the category of mysteries that I might not understand yet, but I can believe that I will get an answer someday. So I think, ultimately, it's a question. Other people, I'm sure, probably in this room have better answers than I do. But for me, I'm okay with where I'm at with it. Yeah.
And we're going to try to take 2 more questions. Before I went to Slido, I wanted to see if anyone else in the room wanted to ask a question live. No worries if not. Okay, cool. So the next Slido question is, how can the Bible explain dinosaurs?
How can the Bible explain dinosaurs? Well, okay, so I guess I'm hoping this isn't like a joke, but there's kind of 2 things to say here, right? So, I feel like oftentimes when dinosaurs come up in the context of creation and evolution, it's kind of like maybe sort of like poking fun at the young Earth creationist view, because the young Earth creationists can't deny that dinosaurs existed, but they also have to say that the Earth and the universe and humankind were all created within the same week. And so, there's this famous image if you go to the Creation Museum is it in Kentucky maybe? I can't remember what state it's in. But there's like a girl playing with a dinosaur. Like there's an image of a girl playing with a dinosaur. Because that's kind of what you have to say as a young earth creationist, that these two things were around at the same time. Whereas, you know, people who aren't young earth creationists typically laugh and point at this because dinosaurs died out like 65 million years ago, right? And humans have been around for less than a million. So that, I would say, that really only becomes a problem if you're a young earth creationist, of having to deal with those two. So maybe if there's a young earth creationist in the room, they could give their answer, but that's not my worldview, so I'm not going to try to address it. As far as another thing you could say is, well, how does God, you know, how does God explain that? I think there are a lot of things in the world that God isn't maybe necessarily the answer to. But neither is atheism, right? Like, nothing inherently about atheism tells us that there should be dinosaurs in the universe. Nothing about theism tells us that there should be dinosaurs in the universe. So really, I think if we want to compare atheism to theism, we need to compare them in the key differences of where we'd expect to see differences between them.
Great, thanks. And our last question is, why can our beliefs lead to truths in the physics interpretation? Why do physical laws break the natural selection arrow in the positive feedback seen earlier?
Okay, so let's think about this for a second. The reason they break the positive feedback is that beliefs are no longer necessary to explain my behaviors, and they're not necessary to explain my survival. Remember that in the evolutionary psychologist view, beliefs play a crucial part, because if I have false beliefs, then I act on those false beliefs, and then I die. And so false beliefs get weeded out, and if I have true beliefs, then those true beliefs cause me to act in a certain way, and that causes me to live, and then I pass that on. There's this causal chain there. The beliefs need to cause something. They cause me to either live if they're right, or they cause me to die if they're wrong, and that's how they reinforce themselves. Physics says, I don't need to talk about beliefs. I can just look at the matter. If I understood the wave function of the universe, if I understood every atom in your body, I could just predict what you're going to do. And then I could predict if you're going to live or whether you're going to die. You could be like a zombie robot, right? With no brain whatsoever, with no beliefs whatsoever. Your actions are determined exclusively by the laws of nature. That means that your beliefs are not actually causing you to act in a certain way. And if they're not causing you to act in a certain way, then they're not going to be reinforced by natural selection. I could try to keep explaining that further, but maybe if somebody still has that question, they should just talk to me afterwards.
Great, thank you so much. Can you all join me in thanking Dr. Tom Rudelius?
Thanks.
Okay, so Dr. Rudelius has graciously offered his time to stay for a couple of minutes after the end of the session, and if you have any questions that you wanted to ask him personally or wanted more information about, feel free to come up to him at the end and ask. And I wanted to remind you that we have two more events in the Reason for God series. The next one is this Thursday, and the following one is next Tuesday. On Thursday, we're going to have a speaker talking about Christianity's claims to exclusivity and whether or not those are, how can there be one true religion? Isn't Christianity exclusive and intolerant in its claim to be the only way to God? And he was a former Muslim who is now a follower of Jesus, so he's approaching it from that perspective. And then I also wanted to give everyone some time to fill out the feedback form that is at your tables. It's the second QR code on the purple sheets of paper. I'm going to give everyone a couple of minutes to do so, and at the end we're going to have a raffle for a $30 Tech Cash prize. going to give a couple more minutes to wrap up the form, and as you do, I'm just wanted to mention that we have free books on the tables outside, so as you're heading out, feel free to grab one. One per student, please. We also have a couple of copies of Dr. Rudelius's book, which is called Chasing Proof, Finding Faith. And if we run out of copies of that before you get to the table, you can write your name down and we'll be sure to get you a copy of that. There are desserts and hot chocolate over in the corner, so feel free to stay around to get more hot chocolate and desserts. Or if you have more questions for our speaker, feel free to stick around and ask him some more questions. He's right there in the back. And then I think we are almost ready to do the raffle. Okay, so we are ready to do the raffle for $30 in tech cash.
Is this on? Oh, wait. Is there a Tory in the room? Tory Fowler? Tory Fowler? Tory. No? Okay, not here, no winner. We'll try again. Chi Ling Liao? Chi Ling? Are you in the room? Oh, is that you? Okay, well he's giving his prize up, so we'll go to the person below. Ted, I know you were here somewhere earlier. You're the next one in the ring, so. That's it.
Okay, congratulations, Ted. Thank you all for coming, and we hope to see you again this Thursday and or next Tuesday, and have a great rest of your night.
Father, when I look at you, all I can see is roses. Can you give me eyes to see the way you see the world again? I don't even know how you can see me, how you do. But somehow every day the way you love me says it's true. We sing your